Time now for a midweek check-in of some major political news so far this week with Ryland Barton, who's the managing editor of Kentucky Public Radio. Good to see you, Ryland.
Good to see you too, Renee.
So we're just 2 months and 1 day away from the governor's race, from the culmination of it on November 7th is Election Day. But before we talk about the governor's race, let's talk about a status update on U.S. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. He's back in D.C. and apparently during the month of August, he was pretty productive in raking in some cash for the party.
Yeah, so he's still dealing with the ripples of his so-called freezing episodes that took place in late July and just last week in northern Kentucky. But he and his team have been doing a lot of work to kind of tamp down some of the worries over that. All of that took place during the August recess. The Senate's back in after the recess. McConnell was back on the Senate floor, speaking on behalf of Republicans, and he said that something happened in August that everybody's been paying attention to, and he's done talking with that. And he touted all these things that he'd heard from Kentuckians during his visits back home. And then today, he's really been making the rounds with other Republican leaders in the Senate, making the case to still keep him in leadership and behind closed doors. And he's been coming at, after these meetings, Republicans have been saying, they still feel confident, or a lot of them have been saying they still feel confident with his leadership. One of his notable things he pointed out, as you said, he raised about $50 million in August on behalf of Republicans for their efforts, their national political efforts. So, that's a big reason how McConnell got to the position that he is, and he's reminding his colleagues that he can still do that, even during this time when everybody's been questioning his health.
And there were some Republicans, notably Nikki Haley, who is running for the presidential nomination for Republicans and former governor, said that something about that the U.S. Senate is like the country's best and noted nursing home, right? And we know that Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene had called for his resignation. So there are a lot of calls, perhaps from maybe some perceived as outsiders in the party, who are calling for him to step aside.
Right. And, in some ways that's been happening for years. There's already been, establishment versus, vanguard splits within the Republican Party going back to the Tea Party movement. Even Kentucky has an example of one of these splits between McConnell and Rand Paul. They really don't agree on some issues and represent kind of different parts of the party. But I think also the thing that this did as well is it reminded Americans and voters of this issue of kind of an aging Congress. And I think that discussion's not going away, even if McConnell stays in leadership, stays in his position. But, that's something that people are going to really be talking a lot about, even going into the presidential election next year, when we're going to have, the oldest, president running for re-election next year, and who knows, possibly another contender if Donald Trump ends up being the nominee, another aging contender. So that's something that I think is reemerged as being a front of mind issue for voters in the country.
And President Biden didn't hesitate when he was asked by some media scrum last week if he thought the leader still is able to lead, and he said yes, or the other opposite to that he shouldn't resign. No. So even President Biden, who himself, as you mentioned, has some age behind him, is defending the leader.
Yeah, both President Biden and to a certain extent, Democratic Governor Andy Beshear. He's said that he's confident that McConnell would stay in office. And I think part of that, too, is that they are not really wanting to stick their necks out on this issue. They do not want to be, say in Beshear's case, campaigning on re-election based on, I want to be the guy to replace, to pick McConnell's replacement. They don't want to kind of show that bad taste politics, I think it might be characterized as. So I thought that's been notable that those two party leaders, at least, have been not voicing that particular opinion.
So now let's shift and talk about the governor's race. Daniel Cameron has taken to the football field to make a point about how his performance as a football player could also be translated to how he would lead as governor.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting, an interesting ad, and that this hadn't really come up yet so far in the campaign season. Yes, Daniel Cameron used to play football for University of Louisville. He was a walk-on player, and he was touting that as showing that he's a hard worker, and then making the that comparison we all knew would happen of sports to politics, and then he wants to be the guy to beat Bashir, raising some of his the points against some of Bashir's coronavirus restrictions throughout the pandemic, and just trying to make that tie in there. It was also a commercial that featured his young son, which is it's an image campaign for Daniel Cameron, and this is coming amid this real onslaught of campaign ads that have started this month and are really going to continue up until the election in November.
And among those, the Democratic Governors Association, DGA, also released an ad that says that Daniel Cameron is trying to rewrite his record on public education.
Right, they're really trying to slam him on this issue. This is Bashir has really made himself out as the public education governor. Every one of his budgets every year involves some raise for teachers and more funding for public education. A lot of people think that that's one of the reasons that he beat former Governor Matt Bevin in 2019 because of some of the former governor's rhetoric around teachers. So that Democratic group is trying to lean into that and attack Cameron on that issue, and also tie him to the former governor as well.
And meanwhile, abortion is also a topic among the ads that are being played. And Governor Beshear has an ad featuring a prosecutor that's about abortion, even though abortion is not explicitly said in the ad.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating ad because it's not something that I think many imagine that Beshear would go out of his way to campaign against Daniel Cameron on. But I think he feels somewhat emboldened by last year's statewide vote that struck down a potential amendment to the state constitution that would have added anti-abortion language to the state constitution. I think he feels a little bit emboldened that Kentucky voters are not really interested in having politicians that are, in favor of an all-out ban on abortion. This ad really focused on the two issues of there being no exceptions for rape or incest under Kentucky's ban on abortion, and that Attorney General Cameron has stood up for the law as written and not called for any more exceptions to be added to it.
Yeah, a lot to keep our eyes on with 2 months and 1 day away. Thank you, Rylan Barton, for doing it for us. We appreciate it. See you next week.
Thanks, Renee.